Welcome to the Naval Postgraduate School Center for Homeland Defense and Security lecture and webinar series. On behalf of CHDS and our co-host today, the Association of State and Territorial Health Officials, the International Association of Emergency Managers, the National Emergency Management Association, the CHDS Alumni Association, and the Naval Postgraduate School Alumni Association and Foundation, thank you for joining us. Today, we're kicking off a two-part webinar series discussing how government roles, responsibilities, and authorities have evolved in recent years and what Homeland Security professionals might anticipate next with the new presidential administration, Congress, and U.S. Supreme Court majority. In this series, we're going to look back at the major events of 2020 and explore what events like these could mean for local, state, and federal government moving forward. In today's discussions, our panel will look back at the major public policy and legal issues that emerged from the pandemic and in the public health response at all levels of government. And then 2 weeks from today, on April 14th, the panel will consider similar questions and challenges that came from security events ranging from the incidents of civil unrest in 2020 to the U.S. Capitol on January 6th of this year. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator for our discussion, Eileen Decker. Eileen is an alumna of CHDS, and she now serves as part of our legal subject matter expert team. Eileen is currently the president of the Los Angeles Police Commission, and she is also a law professor at both USC and UCLA. Previously, Eileen served as LA's deputy mayor of Homeland Security and Public Safety, and also as a former U.S. attorney in Los Angeles. Eileen, thank you for bringing your legal and public policy expertise to today's discussions and for moderating our panel. Now I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Dawn. It's a pleasure to be here today, and we welcome everyone joining us today for this webinar. As Dawn said, we are kicking off a two-part webinar series, and in today's webinar, Whose Pandemic Is It Anyway? We hope to explore a variety of topics related to how local, state, and federal authorities responded to the pandemic. And as a result, what we might expect in the future when dealing with public health emergencies. Our goals for today include focusing on the legal and policy trends of 2020 and what they mean for the work of Homeland Security professionals in the future. How have the roles of the federal, state, and local officials changed as a result of the last year? And what should we expect from this new administration, a Congress that is almost equally divided politically, and from the court system, particularly with a more conservative majority on the Supreme Court? And most importantly, how does this impact state and local decision makers? This is certainly a hefty agenda for our approximate 1-hour conversation. Luckily, we have two highly accomplished individuals to help guide us through all of these issues. So let me begin by introducing them to you. John and Dan, thank you so much for joining us today. John is the Emanuel S. Heller Professor of Law at the University of California, Berkeley. He's also a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institute, a visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, the author of 2 books. First, The Crisis in Command, A History of Executive Power from George Washington to George W. Bush, and Defender-in-Chief Donald Trump's Fight for Presidential Power. He is joined today by his colleague, Dan Farber, a Show Sato Professor of Law, also from the University of California, Berkeley. He is the co-author of Disaster Law and Policy and the author of Contested Ground, How to Understand the Limits of Presidential Power. We are so fortunate to have both of you here. John, Dan, thank you for being with us today, but let's dive right into all these topics. And John, I'm going to throw the first question to you. Given what we have all witnessed in 2020, who will be in charge of the next national public health crisis? Will the calculation change? Will power shift? What do you envision for the future after all we've learned in 2020?
Eileen, thanks for the question. Thanks to the Center for organizing this and inviting me and Dan to join you. Thanks to all of you who are visiting and listening. We really appreciate all of your hard work during these difficult times. I think the answer in short is nobody's really in charge. That's the American way of government, if we hadn't known that already. And that's in great contrast to, say, other countries in Europe or Asia, which have a more unitary government, where every government official works for the national government. Here, I think the lesson of 2020 we saw was that federalism, decentralization, is hardwired into our system. The federal government did not play the primary role in the response to the pandemic. States and localities did. The federal government backed up the states with money primarily, but also research into the vaccine, provision of supplies. But the primary governmental role is played by the states. And there's just quickly two reasons for that. One is the Constitution. Constitution gives the federal government limited powers. Public health is not one of them. In the absence of a clear federal role, states have what we call the general police power and are responsible for public health and safety. The second is, on top of that sort of constitutional skeleton, the muscles that we've built over the last 200 years, the institutional power, the weight of the officials, the resources are with the state and local governments. The federal government, I think, even if it wanted to dictate opening and closing times for all businesses and institutions in the country, couldn't enforce it. The real numbers of enforcement are at the state and local level. And so they are the ones who decided lockdowns, reopenings, distributed vaccines, took care of the maintenance of public health and safety during this pandemic, with the federal government saying, but I don't think in the next emergency or the next pandemic that is going to change.
Thank you, John. Dan, do you want to take a crack at that question? Who's going to be in charge next time around?
I think John is right that states inevitably play a really major role. And as a practical matter, really have to be handling a number of these issues. I do think that the federal government, strangely, in an administration that was really muscular about exercising its powers in other settings, I think the Trump administration actually played a less vigorous role than they might have, given existing statutory power. I think it's also possible that Congress could expand federal power while still respecting the constitutional limits. But I don't really see any sign that that's going to happen. So I would expect something not that different than what we've seen, but I do think that another administration, including the present administration, probably would try to exercise a little bit more leadership and a coordinating role that really wasn't there for parts of the pandemic response earlier.
Well, let's break down each level of the federal government, each branch of government, shall I say, and explore that a little more thoroughly. You've each been speaking about presidential powers. Dan, why don't you just lay a foundation for us, if you don't mind, and can you provide a brief description of where the executive branch derives its emergency power authorities? And then after that, we'll talk about how they've been exercised.
The executive branch has at various times claimed some constitutional powers to respond to emergencies, of course, specifically in the national security area, but also in terms of natural disasters and other events. The parameters of that are not very clear, and that kind of inherent constitutional power hasn't really figured in the response to the public health and pandemic. So other powers are derived from Congress and delegated to the executive branch. And in this case, they're largely in the form of public health statutes, such as the Public Health Service Act, but also to some extent in other emergency statutes like the Defense Production Act, which gives the president and the executive branch some power to organize production of materials that are essential for the national interest. So as a practical matter, it's coming from Congress. Um, the administration may make expansive uses of those powers, but they do trace back to a decision by Congress to authorize federal action.
Thank you, Dan. And John, because you've also written a book on this topic, would you like to expand at all on what Dan said about where the president, the executive branch, derives authority?
I agree with Dan. In the case of the pandemic, it has mostly the powers of the presidency so far, as exercised by Trump and I think also President Biden so far, have really derived from very broad delegations, not unlimited as they are at the states, but relatively broad delegations from Congress. The one footnote I would make to Dan, because I'm a Berkeley professor, so we got lots of footnotes. Footnote I would place to Dan is that you could make a claim, I think, of some presidential authority, much like the kind you've seen presidents raise in the past during emergencies, such as Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War, that suppose Congress didn't act, suppose there had been no delegations of authority, a president could, I think, invoke some kind of inherent executive power in the Constitution to protect the nation's security in the absence of any kind of congressional action, much like occurred at some points in the Civil War. And the second point is just, I think, and we'll get to this, I know later, but some of these readings that the executives, the president has read into some of these statutes are extremely broad, and I think arguably might be beyond the statutes. And so in that case, we might actually be sort of entering this area of inherent executive power. Just one, and then one last footnote on the footnote, because really this is like an academic exercise. It's very different at the states. I would point out there's an interesting contrast. At the state level, take California, Michigan, Pennsylvania, there are very broad laws essentially vesting all of the power of the government, which again is called the police power, in the governor during a period of an emergency. These are much broader grants than anything we see at the federal level.
Well, before we get to the states, which we will get to later, let's focus in even more on the executive branch, because in the last year, we've had the opportunity to see two different administrations, two different presidents address the pandemic in sometimes similar, sometimes different ways. John, if you could go first and talk to us about how the different administrations have used their executive authorities, either broadly, narrowly, similarly, or differently, if you would.
I think so far, because the Biden administration is still relatively young, you see, I think, more continuity in the legal and power dimension, although you see obviously very different emphasis in terms of rhetoric. But take, for example, vaccinations. I could see an argument if President Biden wanted to take a more direct federal role and deliver not just the same thing Trump did, spending the money on developing the vaccine, making the contracts, which are all, as Dan mentioned, under the Defense Production Act, but actually then taking charge of that last step of getting the vaccination into the arms of people. Maybe President Biden could invoke some kind of mixture of authorities to do that. Maybe he could use the National Guard to set up different vaccination centers throughout the country. There have been some talk that the Biden administration might think about doing, but they haven't done that. Even to this point today, the federal government is still playing the same role it did under President Trump, which is using the power of the purse, using the government as a contractor, but then handing the vaccines off to the states. And of course, because it's so decentralized, we're seeing very different rates of vaccination throughout the country, very different policies about vaccination throughout the country. And to the extent there's any kind of uniformity, it's more because the federal government issues guidelines and recommendations that states have been voluntarily accepting, rather than the federal government sort of coercing states. And I think part of that does come from the Constitution and a series of Supreme Court cases that have tried to limit the way the federal government can persuade the states versus getting into unconstitutional coercion. But again, I think that's just because who has the personnel to deliver the vaccinations? It's really state and local government. So I think that those constraints mean that the presidency under Republican, Democrat, Trump, Biden still is operating within the same contours.
Dan, what's your perspective on that?
I agree in general with that. I think we are seeing the same basic sort of modes of action. I do think that the Biden administration may be a little more active in using some of those tools than the Trump administration was, because the Trump administration at some points was distancing itself, I think, from some of the issues raised by the pandemic response, and also was concerned about interfering with the economy. So I think we will see more activity. I think if we were, if we had some kind of big infectious disease crisis every few years, I could imagine the federal government developing a lot of the infrastructure needed to handle more of these tasks, or at least developing an infrastructure that would give it more influence over what the states were doing. But because these events happen rarely, it really doesn't make sense for the federal government to try to develop that kind of resources or personnel. And that means that they're necessarily going to be dependent on the states.
Good. Well, you brought up an interesting point, Dan, about the use of additional authorities. What do you see in the future? Do you anticipate the current administration seeking new authorities for emergency situations, as you just described? Do you expect them to be using more executive orders as we move forward into the future? What's your crystal ball telling you on that?
At least so far, I haven't seen much discussion of seeking new legislation in this area, although I could imagine sort of after the crisis, some efforts to revisit some of the public health authorities and make them a little more explicit. I think we're likely to continue to see reliance on executive guidance and executive orders. And as John said, very aggressive use of some of the existing statutory authorities. I think we'll come back and talk about that aggressive use later, but I agree with John that at some points, I think they have moved to the outer limit of what Congress has authorized.
John, your view on that? What do you see in the next months, weeks, years with respect to executive authority in this area?
I think it's interesting because we're going to need to see more social science work done on whether different aspects of the response to the pandemic had a real effect or not on contagion rates, death rates, and so on, compared to, within the state, amongst the states, or between the states, and then within North America, and then compared to our, peer countries. And so the jury's still out on whether, what kinds of lockdowns, what kind of mask wearing, what kind of vaccination policies were best. And so I could see in the next few years, as we look back on that, we could see some more statutes. I agree, Dan. I don't think the federal government's going to create a public health service much in the way the federal government created TSA after 9/11. Because as Dan said, these could be periodic and rare. But you could see, and this is where I think there would also be a lot of political combat. I could see the federal government expanding its powers over the economy, to open and close certain kinds of industries, to be able to provide more support, financial support to industries, to figure out ways to keep people employed. A lot of the COVID bills were done in very rapid, I think sometimes even sloppy fashion, rapid fire. And it's not clear that they worked. But what did happen was the federal government, I think, really expanded its role in intervening in the economy. And so I think the federal government might, and this happened after the 2008 financial crisis too, whether we're going to make those powers permanent and improve them, I think that's going to be a big area of contention going forward. But I think that's also the most likely area for federal power to expand.
Well, let's explore that a little bit more. And that brings us a bit into the role of Congress as well, because all of these appropriation bills go through Congress and their impact. Do you see, you mentioned perhaps these appropriation bills continuing or becoming more impactful. Why don't we explore that a little bit in terms of the dollars at play and the impact on state and local government and the role of Congress in dealing with a national pandemic? John, why don't you take that on first, since you gave that segue?
Sure. It was unintentional, but I'm happy to segue. Uh, so it's interesting. I think here, in response to the pandemic, the federal government was using the power of the purse to get its policy way, in very similar ways to has in other crises and other federal programs, such as in healthcare or social security or welfare, where it gives a lot of money to the states with conditions, and those conditions are the way the federal government tries to advance its policy interests. And it did that with COVID bailout money as well. The funding power is more attractive to the federal government because the Supreme Court has given it a much looser hand, as it's not as restrictive or rigorous in examining what the federal government does with the spending powers it does when the federal government directly regulates through, say, the Commerce Clause. And so, this does give the states a lot more flexibility in choosing how to respond. So even though trillions of dollars in spending are going out with conditions, you still see very dramatic differences, say in California, where the lockdowns are still only now really being lifted compared to, say, Texas and Florida, where there's no more masks, it seems. In Texas and Florida, a lot of businesses are fully open. That's permissible under this kind of more generous financial package with less federal regulation and more cooperative relationship. The downside of that is, and the Supreme Court has cautioned us about this, is that what if the federal government starts handing out so much money that states really don't have any choice anymore? They really don't have any more flexibility. So I think one interesting issue that just came up in this last $1.7 trillion spending bill was that the federal government, the Congress said, but none of that money can be used to fund tax cuts. And that's a really interesting federalism problem, because does that condition really relate to federal spending on COVID programs? Or is it really an effort to interfere with the sort of sovereign decisions of the states that they have under our constitutional system of a limited federal government and states retaining the general police power?
Yeah, thank you, John. Dan, I'd be curious your view on the role of Congress, particularly moving forward. Since you already mentioned that even the executive's authority comes largely from the statutory delegation from Congress, how do you see Congress getting either more involved or less involved in these national public health emergencies we're seeing?
I think it's actually been surprising the extent to which Congress and even many state legislatures have held back from trying to play an active role in setting policy. We have seen that with spending at the federal level, but we haven't seen Congress really trying to address any of the sort of major public health policy issues that have been involved. At the state level, we're starting to see legislatures becoming a little more active recently, but for quite a long time, they seem to be, in many states, willing to just let the executive branch handle things. I think it would probably be helpful if Congress were to take a look at how to handle these massive public health events, not the sort of more typical public health problems, but these mega disease or other sorts of health impacts, and try to provide a little bit more structure. Maybe revisit the Stafford Act, which applies to natural disasters, but has also been triggered in this case, and try to think a little bit more about how that kind of statutory structure ought to relate to the public health structure, and whether there are any lessons to be learned. For example, the use of incident teams in the natural disaster setting, but we don't have any similar framework, at least that I'm aware of, in the Public Health Center. So I think there is really useful work Congress could do. These days, with partisan gridlock in Congress and various other issues, who knows whether they will actually be able to play that kind of role.
Well, let's shift a little bit, because everything the executive does and Congress does in terms of these authorities, are subject to interpretation by our court system. And traditionally, the courts have been deferential to the executive's use of emergency authorities in many situations. But of course, we've been seeing that change a little bit in recent years. Can you talk a little bit about the impact of what you envision the impact of the current court as Supreme Court as it's currently constituted? Will it restrain executive authority? How will it deal with some of these administrative conflicts and the use of the president's use of emergency power authorities? How are you seeing changes, if at all? Dan, why don't you take that first?
I think as a general matter, the court is clearly more skeptical of administrative powers and has a desire to bring the administrative state under a greater degree of congressional control and to some extent judicial control. What I think is hard to predict is how much of that will filter into the area of emergency response, where traditionally courts, regardless of ideology, have been pretty reluctant to get involved. And we may see a conservative court being more willing to do that, but I can also imagine the court really emphasizing the need for deference to authority in emergency situations. I would particularly expect that to be true in cases that involve sort of traditional national security issues, where the court seems likely to be very deferential. So I'd be very interested in John's views. He can speak from inside to some extent the sort of conservative viewpoint of the court in a way that I'm really not able to do.
Oh, Dan, give it time. They're going to invite you over too to their parties. Don't worry. It's an excellent question, Eileen. And I think Dan's quite right that in emergencies of the past, the courts were extremely deferential. You could go through all of World War I and World War II and see almost no Supreme Court cases that had any kind of intrusive scrutiny on what the executive branch and Congress were doing during an emergency or the Civil War. Usually the courts would wait until well after the emergency before they would start to review the tactics or measures that were taken by the government. I think that started to change over the last 20 years. I personally, I was quite critical of it at the time, but just descriptively what's happened is that I do think the courts are much more confident than they used to be about their ability to review emergency decisions taken by not just the executive branch, but sometimes both the executive and legislative branches, and sometimes to demand a level of proof and a level of evidence and reason that they've never really imposed before. And so I would point out during the pandemic, at the very early stages, there were cases brought challenging the shutdowns. Some of them were based on religious freedom. Some of them were based on free speech, and the courts stayed out of it. But in the last 6 months, the courts have not stayed out of it. And you've seen every level of court, state and federal, and going up all the way to the Supreme Court, where courts have actually struck down restrictions based on COVID justifications, either on people's right to worship, people's right to gather and speak or politically organize, and demanded that the government explain why these restrictions are necessary, why they're different from one group to another or one activity for another. I just say we never really seen, I think, except for this last 2 decades, the war on terrorism in the beginning, but now really during the pandemic, this judicial intervention in reviewing emergency decisions. I think it's really remarkable development. And for everybody who's listening, it's something to keep in the back of your minds that when you have to make these immediate decisions, emergency decisions, sometimes split second or under the pressure, a lot of time and circumstances, some point a court might well review the decisions you're making, but it's going to be not 5 years later, 6 years later, it might just be a few months later.
Well, John, since we do have so many representatives from local and state authorities here, what does this mean on the ground? Like, how should they be thinking about this challenge? Because they have witnessed in many cases certain restrictions being overturned. restrictions they thought perhaps were fair, and restrictions that were designed to protect the public from the illness that people were dying from. How should they take into account this new activity from the Supreme Court and federal courts overall?
That's a tough question, Eileen. I think just from having been in the executive branch, sometimes you have to make a choice of doing something. And what the courts are going to demand is that you be able to explain why you made that choice, that it wasn't just, the legal phrase, arbitrary and capricious, basically. So let's take the example of churches and places of worship. If you're going to apply rules about who can be open, who should be closed, how much distance has to be between people, what mask, the safe thing to do, I think, would just be say, we're going to subject everybody to the same rules. But if you're going to say houses of worship are going to be different, or a political campaign location is going to be different, you have to have a reason why. And it can't just be, I think things might be worse in a church or a synagogue because there's going to be people singing or something. You want to have some kind of, facts that gave you reason to think that, which I know is very difficult for the people listening because sometimes they have to make a split-second decision based on just immediate, totality of the circumstances before you. But understand that the courts will call you to explain why you made that decision. And the answer has to be based on some kind of evidence. You don't have to conduct a study or a poll, but just some evidence you have before you. And then you have to be able to show the logic that led you to that. And so I think in these Supreme Court cases, for example, out of California and New York, where the court struck down some of these restrictions on houses of worship, one, you had, the constitutional protection for religious minorities. But two, both California and New York had a hard time explaining why they were treating, say, a church different than, as Justice Gorsuch said, why is a church different than a bike shop or a nail salon in terms of the restrictions? There is a difference, but you have to be able to articulate it and explain it, not just say, we have the right to make the distinction and we don't have to explain it at all, which is kind of what governments were doing in the beginning of the pandemic.
Dan, do you want to add anything to John's comments on that?
Well, I guess one thing I would add is about the timing issue. As John said, in the early months of the pandemic response, you didn't see this kind of intervention, and it was only later on that you began to see more of a judicial role. And I think one thing that we've seen both with the pandemic and with the war on terror earlier is that courts, I think, are going to be much more deferential to the really short-term emergency response, where there's no time to think and where it seems very temporary. But as it begins to drag on and look a little more long-term, I think that courts start feeling that they can't simply throw up their hands completely. With the war on terror, it's like terrorism's never going away, right? And so at some point you have to say this is no longer really an emergency. This is an ongoing condition. I think you could argue about whether maybe we have or haven't reached that point with the pandemic, but I think courts have started to feel a little bit more that way. I think the other thing is just to be conscious of that there are these areas of constitutional sensitivity where you have to be more thoughtful. Freedom of religion is one. And free speech is another. I think another issue that came up earlier in the pandemic response was abortion, where there was litigation over state regulations that classified abortion as a non-essential medical service, and some of the federal courts upheld that and some didn't. But abortion is going to be a sensitive issue, and whatever you decide in that kind of setting, you just have to be aware that there is more of a risk that you're going to have to justify yourself than in, distinguishing barbershops from takeout restaurants or something like that. So sort of be aware, and I think I have mixed feelings about this sort of judicial willingness to get involved. or also legislative interventions to try to limit emergency powers. On the one hand, emergency powers can be abused or used carelessly, and they can do great harm. On the other hand, every emergency is new and different, and the restrictions that we try to put in place, in one setting may turn out to really be very problematic when the next crisis comes along. I would urge courts and legislatures also to be very conscious of that in thinking about limiting emergency powers.
Well, let's dive into that a little more, Dan, as we focus now on state and local governments and the direction they should be going and what they should be thinking about today, given the lessons of the last year. So Dan, why don't you kick us off with what should state governments be thinking about? Should they be thinking about drafting new legislation with pandemic type situations in mind for the future to address other public health emergencies? What would you advise our state and local counterparts to be thinking of right now?
Well, one obvious thing is, now or, a few months down the road, start doing a postmortem on what was done and where there were, where were there problems, where did things work smoothly, because you can't really do any kind of intelligent reform without that. One very basic thing that I would urge states to do is to really think about whether they have the kind of public health infrastructure in place to deal with this kind of emergency. Public health departments have been subject to sort of financial austerity for a long time, and cutbacks in personnel below levels they used to have and so forth. And most of the time, maybe that doesn't seem problematic, but then when a public health issue comes along, you're really scrambling because you just don't have the people in place to deal with it. I think some kind of time-limited reforms might be useful so that after some period of time, there's an effort to revisit how an emergency is being handled and to involve the legislature more. I think there's no reason why, a year or 2 years into the crisis, the executive needs to be operating solo in these situations. I think that it would be a really bad idea to make rules specifically about whether you can require masks or can't require masks, or close things down or not close things down. And the reason is, even if the legislature has a pretty clear idea that, let's say, there are too many things were shut down this time, this was not a worst case scenario as a pandemic. There are diseases that are much more infectious than COVID, like measles. There are diseases with much higher death rates than COVID, like smallpox. You don't want to put restrictions in place that would make it impossible to respond to a very different kind of crisis. It's also possible that people would feel very differently, for example, if we were facing something that was, say, more clearly a bioweapon, or some other kind of health crisis that we're not even anticipating now. So I do think it's important to walk a careful line between trying to channel discretion, but not handcuff the executive from being able to respond to dire situations that require urgent action, just because somebody 25 years later didn't like the way the COVID was handled.
John, I wonder if you can pick up where Dan has been speaking about, and particularly address the interesting issue of the powers of the executive within the state and its own legislature, and that relationship and division of authorities. How are you seeing things playing out in the future? And what are your recommendations for our state colleagues here?
I agree with Dan that you're going to see some effort to change the balance of power between the executive and state legislatures. For example, my home state of Pennsylvania, the legislature or caucus in the legislature is seeking to amend the Constitution to place limits on what the governor's emergency powers are. You've seen, I think, similar efforts in Michigan, and there's talk of it even here in California. But they're primarily, as Dan mentioned, time limits. The idea of after a certain amount of time, the legislature has to essentially authorize or approve the emergency measures, or they terminate. That's something that's been proposed at the federal level, but has never really made any headway. Uh, I think one thing you're might see, I totally agree, Dan, in terms of emergencies, you don't want to fight the last war, and so overly bureaucratize and regulate an emergency response, because what you're doing with the last war might actually handicap your ability to respond to something completely new and unforeseen. That's the nature of emergencies. If they were predictable, they wouldn't be emergencies. But what I could see also happening is that there has been, I think, some criticism during this current pandemic that there wasn't enough balance between what epidemiologists and public health officials wanted, and then what economists thought were better. And we start talking about the balance between how open to make the economy, how much, how many businesses should be open, what kind of employment should be allowed. And so I think you could see state legislatures also trying to do that, not itself write the rules about how businesses should reopen or what should be active or allowed to be active or not, but trying to inject within the executive branch itself more deliberation or consideration or debate between whether it's public health this time or national security next time, or physical disasters, environmental next time, and consideration of the effect on the economy, because economists are going to try to use more of a cost-benefit approach. You see that's something that's often done at the federal level. So Congress, when certain decisions are made, say that have environmental impacts, it will actually require different branches of the federal government to essentially consult and debate with each other before the federal government reaches a final decision. I could see that happening in the emergency context too in the future.
Thank you. Dan, you and John have spoken and given so much to think about with respect to our state partners. What about on the city and county level? What should our partners there be thinking about right now?
The relationship between city, county, and state authorities is very much a matter of state law, which means that there are 50 different legal regimes. And so it's really hard to say a lot about in general about how we might think about revising these regimes. There are, I think, some interesting questions about whether in some states cities should be given a greater role in public health. Some cities, like say New York, have very robust public health departments, but there are other places where it's only the county or some other unit of government. I think we ought to be thinking about some of those things. And I think one of the things we've discovered is that some of the channels of communication between public health officials, the sort of health providers in general, and state authorities have not operated as smoothly. One thing we haven't really talked about is information. And one of the things I think we learned from this pandemic is that our information systems for this kind of situation, for tracking things like hospital admissions and causes of death and test results and all those kinds of things, have really been very clunky. The IT structure has been bad. There hasn't been any kind of uniformity in the way records are kept and so forth. That's something I think all levels of government really ought to be thinking about fixing. That's something that even outside of the pandemic situation, that's information we can use. And certainly in dealing with a health emergency, we really need to be able to do better next time.
John, woven throughout our entire conversation so far this morning has been individual liberties and the rights of individuals, rights of businesses, businesses to stay open, rights of individuals to go out, wear masks, not wear masks. What should our colleagues who are here on the webinar today be thinking about in terms of the next public health crisis as they try to factor in all these individual liberties that have really been brought to the forefront through this pandemic we've all been experiencing in the last year? And I'll add to that, if you would, John, also address this concept of trust. Dan talked about information systems, but also this trust, lack of trust in such a polarized world. Would you kick us off on that, please, John?
Yeah, Eileen, actually, your second question was going to be my answer to your first question, which was, I think one thing the response to this pandemic, I think underscored to me was how much the effectiveness of state and local measures are dependent on voluntary compliance by the citizens. There aren't enough police officers to check and see whether there are too many people at Thanksgiving dinner. You might remember that was one of the, don't have too many people for Thanksgiving. Right? The way to really get society to follow the right measures to contain the spread of a contagious disease like this has to be voluntary compliance. The police are not going to be able to spend enough time giving every business in a city that's going to demand to stay open a ticket or to try to force them to stay closed. The businesses voluntarily closed. That's the remarkable thing to me was that even though we are a country with a longstanding tradition of individual liberty, much more, I think, than our Asian and European peer countries, most people voluntarily complied with the regulations of the cities and the states and the counties. So I think going forward, that's an important thing to build on, is to also, that means being open about where you were wrong, taking criticism, responding to criticism, but also pointing out where you were right, and building a kind of relationship with the community where all of you are, so that when the next emergency happens and you have to take emergency measures, again, the citizenry will voluntarily follow, so that you don't have to spend a lot of resources on enforcement, and you can spend a lot of resources on what you want to. So, based on what we know in the legal system, we've done a lot of research psychologically on why do people obey the laws. Essentially, it's interesting. It's a whole field of study in law. It's like, why do people listen to us? Essentially, we don't know. But one of the things we've learned is that when the people are convinced that the government officials were reasonable, that the reasons why the rules were necessary were explained to them, or they trust that at least you went through a good process when you made the rule, people are much more likely to voluntarily follow the rules without any need for coercive enforcement by the government.
Dan, what's your perspective on all of this? How do we protect individual liberties while protecting the public from a pandemic? How do we balance that out?
I think when it comes down to the use of coercion versus individual rights, that's going to be a very fraught question. We've been struggling with that in the context of war and national security since Congress passed the Alien and Sedition Acts, and at the beginning of the Republic. I think that John is right that voluntary compliance is crucial. That's one thing I think that all of us, like John, have seen. That's not really unique to this situation. I just read a book about the 2014 Ebola outbreak in West Africa. And one of the major problems there was massive distrust by many members of the population, of the government, and of health authorities. And that really hindered the response there. So it's not just like the US and not anywhere else. I agree with John about the need to sort of demonstrate reasonableness, and also to show that you actually listened. People are more willing to accept something if they feel they were heard, even though it's an emergency and it's really hard to take time to do that. I think that pays dividends. I think building connections with sort of local trusted figures, not counting on a popular or maybe unpopular national figure to make the point, but local people who are trusted seems to carry a lot of weight. This is a general problem for our society too, right? public trust in institutions is much lower now than it was 40, 50 years ago. And that's something we have to live with. And in a pandemic, it's all the more dangerous. So we're not going to have perfect solutions. But I think that we can do better. I think too many of us thought that once you explain the health facts, everybody will just automatically do the right thing. And it turns out you have to do a lot more work than that to get the results you want.
Thank you. Before I turn it over to Dawn for questions that are coming in, I do want to first remind everyone listening, if you have a question, to please put it in the Q&A, and we'll get to as many of those questions as possible. But before we go there, a final question, and Dan, I'll start with you. An issue that's percolating on the horizon is vaccine mandates. Can employers require it? Vaccine mandates and vaccine passports. How do you see these playing out in the months to come?
Well, that is looming as an issue. I don't particularly see why an employer should not be able to require vaccination, assuming that there is a real health concern behind it, and that it's not, I don't know, motivated by some other consideration. If you want to work at a university, for example, I think this is still true. It's certainly been true when I was hired. You, in many places, had to have a TB test to show that you're not carrying tuberculosis. If you want to be a student, you have to have a TB test. And I know that's still true. If you want to, kids go to school, we have vaccination requirements. So I don't really see that, to me, as deeply problematic, except to the extent that those requirements are imposed without a genuine health requirement. I think there are a lot of situations where people are going to want to be able to demonstrate that they were vaccinated, if only for international travel in countries that are going to be demanding proof. And that's going to require some kind of infrastructure, I think, that will enable people to show that they have that information, which means at least some availability of vaccination passports. I have to admit, obviously other people view all this as much more problematic than I do, and it may be that I just don't really understand their perspective. But at least from my point of view, it mostly just seems like common sense.
John, what are your thoughts on this issue, particularly with the legal issues that may be looming in this area?
I think for private employers, I don't think it's a big problem. Right? Private employers generally have freedom to impose these kind of restrictions unless they discriminate based on race or gender or disability, and it doesn't seem that these would. But when it comes to the government requiring a passport, the federal government does control travel between the states and internationally. The states do have the right to control travel within a state, but there the courts have required there to be some kind of basis for the restrictions on travel. In fact, it's interesting, the right to travel does not appear in the constitutional text, but the Supreme Court has said it is a core constitutional right. And so, for example, the government couldn't say only Republicans are allowed to travel to Texas, but not Democrats. Although that's what seems to naturally happen on its own anyway. But right, the government's not allowed to place restrictions that interfere with individual liberties on the right to travel. So you could see some classes of people, I suppose, say, I just don't want to get a vaccine because of my beliefs. That would be an interesting case. I could also see people, I think it's a loser in terms of the legal merits, but you could see people saying, look, the decision to require vaccines after a certain period of time becomes arbitrary because the government can't show anymore that requiring the vaccine is really going to decrease the contagion level, contagion level in the country. I don't think that's a winning argument right now, or for the next few months, but what if it's like a year from now? What if these passport requirements are still in effect? And so again, I think you'll see the same dynamic we saw before. Initially, in the beginning, the courts will be deferential, but as time goes on, they're going to demand to see more proof from the government about whether the restrictions still work. Even accepting the courts themselves are not going to claim that they have, they're the scientists in chief.
Thank you, John. We're going to be spending the rest of our remaining time answering some of the questions that came in live. Dawn, do you have some of those questions for the panel now?
I do, Eileen. We have a series of questions coming in from practitioners who say that there really wasn't a need for so much ambiguity early in the response, that plans had been developed at every level of government and exercised about a pandemic response. But sometimes those plans and even some things captured in statute were not followed. What happens then if things are either already captured in law or in plans, and executive privilege and prioritization and prerogative are executed to maybe supersede what's already on the books?
I mean, I take a stab at that. I think, there is all kinds of contingency, at least in my experience in the federal government, there's all kinds of contingency plans and exercises that are run to try to anticipate emergencies and unforeseen events. But still, you want to have the flexibility in the top leadership of the government to be able to change those because the circumstances are going to be different than the ones you trained and planned for. And so I think, to me, the way to cure that, if the concern of the questions is actually the governors or whoever were wrong to deviate from established plans and so on, and I think this is what I think the next step is in state legislative or even state judicial intervention in these matters is going to be to try to force there to be more deliberation within the executive branches of states, understanding that there's limited time to make decisions and limited resources and information at the beginning of pandemics. Again, this is the model that the federal government the Congress has tried to use with the executive branches. If you're worried about rash action or error-prone action, which itself is an inevitable feature of having to act quickly and first, maybe at least you can force different parts of the executive branch of a state government to have to be involved in the discussion. Maybe the governor still chooses to change the contingency plans that were developed earlier, but at least you can be sure that everybody had the relevant input, and then that governor has to take political accountability why he or she chose to change things or to keep them the same.
Very good. Dawn, do we have another question or series of questions?
We do. One question from one of our local participants, and this is not legal as much as maybe public policy. Any strategies or advice for local officials to help promote and advocate for clarifications from their state and federal partners? So before they get the mandates, any advice for how they can seek clarification and maybe seek input as some of the directives are being developed?
Dan, do you want to take that?
The sort of inner workings of state government and relationships with local governments and other officials is obviously pretty opaque for those of us on the outside. I think, again, this may go back to a theme that John has been touching on about the need for better communication and for establishing communication lines in advance. It's one of the reasons exercises are so useful is that people really kind of have to get to know each other a little bit before the actual emergency. You can't really start learning to communicate and trust each other when the place is burning down. So at least in the long term, I think we need to see more of that. I think that's also true. I imagine that a lot of governors' offices really haven't had much contact with public health officials on a regular basis. And maybe we need to think about ways of building better bridges. So during emergencies, the governor has a better idea of who they're dealing with and, why that person may be worth listening to. One thing that occurs to me is maybe we do need to connect public health a little bit more with emergency response people, because governors do deal with their state emergency response, sort of a FEMA equivalence on a fairly regular basis, and that's an established channel of communication. But I don't really have any advice of what you should do if you're the mayor of Oakland and you think Governor Newsom hasn't been listening enough. That's really just sort of outside my domain.
Right, but establish those relationships well in advance, have them
Exactly.
solidified so when the crisis hits, those relationships are well in place, much like very traditional public safety models that have developed, particularly in the post 9/11 era.
Exactly.
Dawn? Do you have
Eileen, a
another
question for anyone on the panel about vaccine mandates, particularly on the border and the southern border. What's the U.S. government's prerogative and position to put mandates in place for those entering the country?
Interesting.
I can answer that pretty quickly. The federal government has what the Constitution calls plenary, or the Supreme Court is called plenary authority over immigration. And the Supreme Court has backed up that position repeatedly, which is that states are not actually even allowed to place conditions or control who's entering the country. That's totally different once they're inside the state. And then you're not allowed to single out aliens and treat them differently under state law, but you're still regulating them because they're residents, they're in the state. So if it were, suppose the federal government wanted to impose a requirement that every alien entering the country have been vaccinated or have already had COVID and is immune, I think that's when the federal government's powers. It's fairly plenary. States don't really have the right to interfere. This was made clear in a case called Arizona, United States versus Arizona from a few years ago. And the courts have been, and this is an area where they continue to be deferential to the federal government. They don't really place a lot of scrutiny on the restrictions that the federal government imposes on immigration. You might recall the case of Hawaii versus Trump at the very beginning of the Trump administration, where critics claimed that Trump's travel ban was motivated because of animosity to Muslims or so on. And the courts were extraordinarily deferential and upheld the travel ban. And I would expect they would have that same attitude towards something like a vaccine mandate for travel across the border.
Thank you, John. Dawn, any further questions?
I think we have a time, Eileen, for one more question. Generally, and for any of the panelists, what does all this mean for tribal governments who have a slightly different relationship with federal partners? What elements of mandates, regulation, shared roles and responsibilities apply perhaps differently to our tribal partners?
I'll just jump in and say that, like almost everything dealing with tribal government, involves a lot of very complicated questions about Indian law. Tribes have some degree of inherent sovereignty, particularly as to regulating their own members. The question of how much regulatory authority they have over non-members gets very complex. And again, it seems to me that's an area where states and tribal governments really ought to be talking to each other on an ongoing basis, because there are going to be some really tricky legal issues about coordination between them. I'm not enough of an expert on Indian law to be able to give a very detailed summary of who can do what, but because there are these complicated jurisdictional boundaries, it is something that's going to require real attention.
Thank you. And thank you, Dawn, for all those questions. Why don't we turn then to some closing comments from both you and John. Dan, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I think that some themes have emerged today about the need for building communication and maybe creating a little more structure for consultation and decision-making. I think in the areas of emergency response in the last 20 years or so in particular, We've started to develop some of the kinds of institutions that are needed for that. And it may be that that can provide a useful model for this area as well. So I think that's something that's worth exploring. We have this issue of trust, and I think at this point, anyone can really say is, yeah, that's obviously important. That's something we need to work at a lot harder than we have in the past.
Thank you, Dan. John, your closing comments?
I guess thinking about the hour we've spent, we've talked a lot about what would the perfect policy be in a way. If you were king for a day or queen for a day and you could impose it. But at the same time, we've seen over the last year, I think, that this goes back to we have this enduring principle of decentralization in our government, which makes the imposition of a single policy almost impossible. And so what I would give as a piece of advice then, a lesson to take away is when thinking about this pandemic and the next emergency is not to feel frustration running up against federalism and decentralization and the separation of powers, but figuring out ways to harness it in order to reach the best policy. And some of those ideas are ones we've worked on, talked about at the program and the center for for many years, about why does decentralization and federalism at times lead to better public policy making than we see in other countries where you have a much more unified system of government. And it goes to one of the points Dan made. We think that federalism and decentralization is much better at producing much more information about public policy problems and how to deal with them, because you see a much greater diversity of policies and solutions. And we have a big, large country, which itself is diverse in geography and people. And so maybe decentralization is the better way to handle a country of 350 million people spread across a whole continent. So I just close saying, let's figure out how to harness and take advantage of decentralization rather than struggling against it all the time, because I do think it is hardwired into our system.
Well, thank you, John. Thank you, Dan. Thank you both for your great insights today on some very, very complex and thorny issues that we're all dealing with. Very much appreciate your thoughts. And I'd like to recognize everyone who joined us today for everything you are doing and everything you've done in the last year to protect our country and to help us work towards solving all these problems. Thank you all very much. Dawn, back to you.
Thank you, John, Dan, and Eileen. Particularly, thank you for moderating today's conversation. As I mentioned earlier, we will be coming back together in 2 weeks. So Wednesday, April 14th, for a second part of this conversation. We'll be looking back at the security events in 2020. So everything ranging from civil unrest to the January 6th events at the U.S. Capitol. We invite you all back, and you'll see in the Q&A portion a link. If you have not had a chance to register for our second session, please do that. On behalf of the Center for Homeland Defense and Security and our co-host at ASTO, IAM, NEMA, and CHDS Alumni Association, and the MPS Alumni Association and Foundation, thank you for joining us today, and we hope to see you back in a couple of weeks as we continue this conversation. Thank you and have a good day.